How do we add a new artifact? Let's take a look at the API documentation. The client side will make a POST request and send the new artifact through this JSON object in the request body. There is name, description, and image URL. The controller will retrieve those values and copy them into an empty artifact object. Then we can use the artifact repository's save method to save it to the database. The sequence diagram design is very similar to find an artifact by ID. Let's start with the controller. Let's create a handler method to handle this POST request. Add artifact. This is a POST mapping, so let's annotate it using add POST mapping. The URL is API version 1 artifacts. Recall that this POST mapping here has a request body that contains a JSON object with artifact name, artifact description, and artifact image URL. The question is, how do we retrieve them from the request body and put them in an artifact object? Once again, Spring MVC comes to help us. Spring MVC has a built-in data binder to simplify this process. It can bind the JSON request body to the formal parameter of this artifact method. So next, let's define a formal parameter to accept the JSON data. We could use artifact, but remember we defined something called artifact DTO, and DTO is data transfer object. So it's really a perfect candidate in this case. Artifact DTO, artifact DTO. This is not enough. We need to annotate this formal parameter using add request body. This annotation annotates this formal parameter of this handler method. This annotation will let Spring MVC automatically retrieve the three values, name, description, and image URL from the JSON request body. Then instantiate an artifact DTO record and bind the three values to the fields of this artifact DTO. Since the client does not provide any information about the owner, so the owner field of the artifact DTO will be null. No big deal. This picture shows the entire process. So inside this add artifact method, the artifact DTO record is already initialized and is ready to use. That's great. The controller then delegates to the artifact service object. So let's go to artifact service. After find all, let's define a save method to save the artifact. Save new artifact. For this new artifact, it has name, description, and image URL provided by the front end. What about its ID? It is the responsibility of the server side to generate an ID for a new artifact, because the client side does not know how to assign an ID. In this project, I'm using an ID generator based on Twitter's Snowflake algorithm. I have already copied this class. Under artifact package, let's create a new package called utils. Utils means utilities. Paste. Don't worry about the details of this algorithm. The only important thing you need to know is the name of this class, ID worker, and this constructor. So when we create an instance of the ID worker, we need to pass worker ID and data center ID. Also, this method nextID. So when we call ID worker.nextID, this method will return us a unique ID. But notice that the ID is of type long. So if we want to use it as the ID of the artifact, we'll have to convert this long ID into string ID. Okay, let's close this. So if you're interested in this algorithm, go ahead and Google Twitter's Snowflake algorithm. My point here is that different companies may have different ID generating algorithms. So next, I want to show you how to integrate the ID worker into our Spring Boot project. So let's go to the main application class. I want Spring to manage the ID worker. Public ID worker and ID worker. And in this method, we're going to return an instance of ID worker, new ID worker, and then pass in the worker ID and the data center ID. How do we let Spring manage the instance of ID worker? Okay, so here's how I do it. I'm going to annotate this method using @bin. So this is how I declare the ID worker object as a bin that can be managed by Spring. When Spring Boot is started, this method with @bin annotation will get called. The returned ID worker instance will be treated as a Spring bin and managed by Spring. If another bin wants to use it to generate an ID, we can just inject this ID worker bin to the bin that needs to generate an ID. Next, let's inject this ID worker bin into artifact service, because the artifact service needs to generate an ID for a new artifact. So in this case, besides the artifact repository, artifact service also depends on the ID worker. We're going to use constructor to inject it. Instead of modifying the constructor, I'm lazy. So I'm just going to delete this constructor and let IntelliJ regenerate a constructor for me. Select both fields and click OK. Okay, it's done. So now this save method can use this ID worker to generate a unique ID for every new artifact. Now let's follow the red, green, and refactor TDD approach. First, let's create a test method for save. @test, and let's call this method test save success. We'll have given when and then. Let's create a fake new artifact. That's the artifact we're going to pass to artifactService.save method. It's an artifact without ID. New artifact dot set name. For example, let's just call it artifact number 3. New artifact dot set description. Just call it description. New artifact dot set image URL, and its image URL. Okay. Next, let's define the behavior of the mock object. Well, here in this case, the save actually depends on 2 mocks. One is the repository.save, and the other one is the ID worker.nextID, the class we just created. So that means we have to declare that ID worker as a field of this test class, and also annotate it as mock. So let's go all the way to the top. Here. After the first mock, let's define the second mock. ID worker, ID worker. And we don't have to worry about injecting, because this inject mocks will inject the 2 mocks into this artifact service. That's why the name is inject mocks, because there are 2 mocks that needs to be injected into the artifact service. Okay. Let's go down here. First, let's define the behavior of the mock ID worker. Given ID worker dot next ID, instead of really generating an ID using Twitter's Snowflake algorithm, in this case, just return 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Remember, the return value should be of type long. Okay, so line 136 is returning a fake data instead of really generating a unique ID using the algorithm. Next, let's define the behavior of the second mock, artifact repository. Given artifact repository.save, and in this case, we're going to pass this new artifact to save. Instead of really inserting this artifact into a database, just return the new artifact. Okay, so a new artifact comes in and a new artifact goes out. It's the same artifact. But we rely on the save method in the artifact service to set an ID, and we're going to verify that the ID is set correctly, and it's really being set. Okay, so that's all for the given part. Then let's invoke this method. Artifact service dot save. And I'm going to pass the new artifact in. And let's call this saved artifact. In the then part, or the assertion part, let's assert that artifact dot get ID is equal to copy and paste 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then let's copy some code. And here it will be get name is equal to new artifact dot get name. Okay. And here is get description is equal to the provided description. And finally, get image URL is equal to the provided URL. And finally, we're going to verify that artifact repository times 1. The save method in artifact repository is called exactly once. Feel free to pause the video and make sure you understand the given, when, and then. Next, let's start the test case. Run test save success. And it fails because of the null pointer exception. Because right now, in the service, the save is returning null. All right. Next, let's implement the save method in the artifact service class. Okay, it's very simple. Okay, now in service, before we invoke artifact repository.save, let's first create an ID for this new artifact. New artifact dot set ID. And the service is relying on ID worker, which is the injected dependency dot next ID. But remember, next ID returns a long number. We have to convert it to string because the type of the ID is string. And there is an easy way to do it. Simply just string concatenation and empty string. There you go. So in return, we simply just call this dot artifact repository dot save and pass this new artifact. Now at this moment, the new artifact already has an ID. It has an ID, name, description, and image URL. The owner is null. That's fine. Okay, now let's come back to the test case and run the test case again. And hopefully it will pass. It passed. Next, let's work on the test method for the controller. So let's create a test method for add artifact. Let's define given, when, and then, because in controller, we always combine when and then. In given, we're going to prepare a fake artifact DTO record so that we can pass to add artifact. So let's create one. Artifact DTO, artifact DTO, new artifact DTO. So the ID is null because the front end is not providing the ID of the new artifact. And the name can be, for example, remember, which is a very interesting artifact. And here is a description. Let me copy and paste from the API documentation. And the last one is image URL, which is just image URL. And the owner will be null. Okay, it's pretty long. Let me break it here. Okay. Okay. Now here is another problem. Mock MVC can simulate a post HTTP request, but it cannot send this artifact DTO with this HTTP request. That means we have to first convert this guy into a JSON object or JSON string. Because we know from the API documentation, the front end is not sending this DTO, but is sending a JSON object with name equal to this, description equal to this, and so on and so forth. Then how do we convert a DTO to a JSON string? We can use Jackson. But before we use it, we have to inject it into this test class, the artifact controller test class. So let's scroll all the way up to the fields. After this mock beam, add auto-wired object mapper. Make sure it's from com.fasterxml.jackson.databind. Object mapper. Okay, then Spring Boot will inject this object into this test class, and we can use it to serialize that artifact DTO record. Let's go back here. This dot object mapper dot write value as string artifact DTO. And there's potentially an exception, so let's throw this exception. Okay, so this JSON string will have name, description, and image information. ID and owner will be ignored, just like this. Okay, so here we defined the fake input data to add artifact method. Next, let's define a fake data that will be returned by artifact service.save. To save some time, I've already copied the code snippet. Paste here. Okay. Next, let's define the behavior of the artifact service.save. So given this dot artifact service.save, and here I'm going to use makito.any artifact.class, and we return this saved artifact. So if the controller is calling artifact service.save and passing an instance of artifact, then this save method will return this artifact with the ID, name, description, and image URL. A small summary here. We prepared a fake artifact DTO and then use Jackson to serialize it into a JSON string. So this simulates what the front end provides to the controller. Since the controller will dedicate to the service, we also have to mock the behavior of artifact service.save. So once this method gets called, it's not really going to save it to the database. Instead, we'll return this predefined fake data, which is an artifact with an ID. Okay, next, let's define when and then. So let me copy and paste from the previous this.mark.perform. Copy this. And paste. Copy and paste is pretty dangerous. So don't do it at home. Okay, let's change it. So first, this is a post request. Make sure you import the correct static method. It's from mock MVC request builders. The URL is good. This one indicates the client is accepting a JSON as response. And also, since this is a post, the client is also sending JSON as request. So let's add this dot content type. And this is JSON as well. Okay, so this indicates that the client is both sending and receiving JSON data. And of course, don't forget the payload, content JSON. So this JSON is the serialized artifact DTO right here. Okay, so this is how we send a JSON string using mock MVC. All right, now let's keep going. The flag is good, the code is good. Oh, by the way, we will define the test case for a controller. Make sure the API documentation is available. Okay, you should always refer to the API documentation to know what is expected. The message should be add success, and we don't need those. And let me delete this as well. Okay, because it returns only one artifact. So we're going to say dot ID dot is not empty. Okay, at least there is ID. Okay, then let me copy this, paste. This should be data.name. And here it should be saved artifact dot get name. So let me copy and paste for description for image URL. Get image URL. Next, let's run this test case. As you can see, it fails. JSON cannot be null or empty because right now our controller is just returning null, right? So next, let's implement this add artifact. And here you're like, well, this is easy. Let's just use this dot artifact service dot save. And then we're going to pass this artifact DTO to it. Problem solved. But you see here, there's a problem. If you move the cursor over, you will see that artifact service.save requires artifact as input, but the controller is providing artifact DTO. So that means it is the responsibility of the controller to first convert this artifact DTO to an artifact and then invoke the save method of the artifact service. Then how do we convert artifact DTO to artifact? Recall that we have done the reverse using a converter called artifact to artifact DTO converter. So same thing. Let's create the second converter to convert artifact DTO to artifact. So let's delete this. And let's go to converter. So under artifact converter package, right click, new, a class. This time it is called artifact DTO to artifact converter. Let's have it implement converter. Now make sure this converter is from org.spring framework. The first generic will be artifact DTO. We're going to convert it to the second generic is artifact. Okay, make sure we import it. All right. Next, let's implement methods. Click convert, click OK. All right, first, let's create an instance of artifact. Artifact, artifact, new artifact. Next, let's populate the fields in this artifact using the information stored in this artifact DTO. Artifact.set ID source.get. Well, since artifact DTO is a record, in record, the getter is called just ID, the same as the name of the field. So ID, that's the getter for the ID field. Then let's copy and paste. Set name, and here will be just name. Set description, here will be description. And finally, set image URL. Okay, since the client is not providing any information about the owner, that's okay. Then the owner in the artifact will just be null. No problem. In the end, don't forget to return this artifact. All right. Before I close this file, there's one last thing to do, is that if we want Spring to help us manage the instance of this class to do dependency injection, we have to notify Spring by annotating this class using @component. So when Spring Boot starts, Spring will create an instance of this class and treat it as a bin and can inject it to other bins that need this conversion. So that means we need to first inject that converter into this class, controller class. Then here, add artifact can use that converter. So let's go all the way to the fields. Let's declare the converter as a field. Artifact DTO to artifact. All right. Again, I'm lazy, so I'm going to delete this old constructor and let IntelliJ regenerate the constructor. So select all the three fields and click OK. All right. Now we can use this artifact DTO to artifact converter inside this controller class. Okay, so first we need to convert artifact DTO to artifact. And we can do that by using this dot. Make sure you pick the right one. Artifact DTO to artifact converter dot convert. And we're going to pass in artifact DTO. Okay. So this returns a new artifact. All right, next we can invoke this dot artifact service dot save and save the new artifact. And the save method returns the saved artifact. Okay. Now, can we return the saved artifact directly to the client? Of course not. In that case, we'll encounter this JSON infinite recursion problem due to the one-to-many relationship between the wizard and the artifact. So we have to convert it again. We have to convert the returned saved artifact into a DTO before we respond to the client. This dot, make sure you pick the right one. This time is artifact to artifact DTO converter dot convert the saved artifact. And here we're going to call this saved artifact DTO. Okay. Next, we're going to return new result. Okay. So let me make sure I know what the results are. True as flag, status code dot success, and the message will be add success, and the payload is, now remember, it's not saved artifact, but saved artifact DTO. Okay. All right, now, before I run the test case again, just eyeballing the code we write here, do you think we can pass the test? So we're expecting true success as success. The ID is not empty. Okay, so the ID is from the saved artifact. Then the value of name, the value of description, the value of image URL. Okay, so let's run the test and hopefully it will pass. Okay, it passed. It passed. All right, that's very good. Next, let's go back to the API documentation. As you can see here, when the front end is sending this post request to add a new artifact, it is possible that the server returns a bad request, 400. We need to consider this scenario of bad requests. In other words, if the client fails to provide some required fields, then the server side should send back a bad request response, just like this. What should we do? Well, in Spring Boot, this is pretty simple, but we need to use another dependency. So let's search Spring Boot starter validation. Okay, click mavenrepository.com. Click the latest version and copy this coordinate. Then let's go back to IntelliJ. All right, we have copied the dependencies coordinate. Let's go to pom.xml and scroll all the way down to the dependencies element right here. Paste. And make sure you reload. Okay. Now let's look at dependencies. Okay, we have successfully downloaded and imported this dependency. Validation. Okay, let's close POM. Let's go to artifact DTO. To indicate that name, description, and image URL are required, we can add an annotation called @not empty. Now, this annotation is from jakarta.validation.constraints. If the name is empty, then there will be some default error messages, but we also can customize the message. Name is required. description is required, image URL is required. Are we done? Almost. Let's go back to the controller. Now, do you remember that Spring MVC will automatically bind the three values, name, description, and image URL from post mapping's request body JSON to this DTO. And we have to tell Spring MVC to validate the three fields, or any fields with an annotation. And here is the annotation, @valid. It is also from Jakarta.validation. That's it. So if the name is empty, then this method will throw an exception. But we need to properly handle this exception. In other words, we need to get the message of the exception and put it in a result object and return it to the client to let the client know that what's wrong. Recall that we actually have done very similar things before. That is, how do we handle the exception artifact not found? When that exception is thrown, there is something called, right here, exception handler advice will kick in and handle this request and return a result with the detail of this exception. Okay, so let's do the same thing here. To save you time, I've already copied the code snippet to handle the validation exceptions. So copy and paste. So let me make sure I import all those classes. Okay, now it's happy. Okay, so what happened here is if the name is missing, or if the description is missing, or the image URL is missing, an exception will be thrown. And once that exception is thrown, this exception handler method will handle that exception. So basically, it will go over the exception and retrieve all the messages and encapsulate them in here. So this is the detailed exception message. For example, name is required, description is required, image URL is required. And the status here is invalid argument. And basically, this is 400. Okay, so before we start testing using Postman, there's one more point. Besides @empty, you can also define something like @length, okay? And you can specify the minimum length and maximum length of this name. You can also define our best friend regular expressions, okay? I'm not sure if it's best friend, but it's a good friend. Okay. And in this case, we do not need regular expression, but it's possible. Let me delete those. Okay, all right. Let's launch our project and test in Postman. All right, our Spring Boot project is running. First, let's go to H2 database. And let me copy the correct one. Okay, and select artifact and run. Right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 artifacts. Next, let's toggle over to Postman. Okay, so let's create a new request. Let's call it add an artifact. So that's the URL and the post. And here for the body, let's click raw JSON. Okay, let's go to the API documentation right here. And copy this example, paste here. All right, so if I click send, if everything is fine, I'm supposed to get 200, which is success. All right, we did it. So this is true, 200, and this is a newly generated ID. Let's go back to the H2 console and see if a record has been reinserted. Let's run again. Okay, now we have remember all, and the owner is null. Okay, so this is description, and this is the ID. Next, let's try some empty name, description, and image URL. So this time, let's make it empty. Let's also make this empty. Okay, so when I click send, okay, we still get a response in this format. Flag is false, 400. Provided arguments are invalid, see data for details. As you can see, this is that map. If you still remember that, the map. We're collecting all the validation exceptions and put them in this map, key-value pairs. Name is required, description is required, image URL is required. Okay, we just finished the API endpoint add an artifact, which corresponds to the second user story in this issue. Let's select it. Next, let's work on update an artifact, the fourth user story in this issue. I'll see you in the next video.